Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Scotland at 7 with me, Gordon Ross. It's the 15th of March today. Joining me this evening from Aberdeen, beg your pardon? The 16th, I beg your pardon. A little misprint on my script there, the 16th. Joining me this evening is Audrey Nicoll, the SNP candidate for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. Welcome to the programme, Audrey. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here.
Right, Audrey, I'm just going to kick off, first of all, with the usual coronavirus update, first of all. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,750,277 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and the UK government's regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,539,672 have been confirmed negative. 210,605 have tested positive. There are 597 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. This, of course, is an underestimate of the number of cases because not everyone with the virus displays the symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 7 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive today. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by COVID-19 infections now stands at 7,517. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 440 were in hospital last night, 42 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 1,943,507 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 170,892 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 125,690 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 110 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. And now to the ONS update. The percentage of people testing positive for COVID-19 continued to decrease in England and Wales and appears to have levelled off in Northern Ireland and Scotland the week ending March the 6th, 2021. The hospital admissions rate in England also continued to decrease, with the latest week ending the 7th of March. The number of registered deaths involving COVID-19 in England and Wales decreased in the week ending the 5th of March. An estimated 34.6% in England and 30.5% in Wales, 31.2% in Northern Ireland and 22.3% in Scotland had had COVID-19 antibodies in the 28 days to the 3rd of March 2021. The majority of adults in Great Britain, that's 93%, said that they had either received or are awaiting or would be likely to have the COVID-19 vaccination if it's offered. The number of all deaths registered in England and Wales in the week ending the 5th of March 2021 was 11,592, nearly a fifth. 2,105 of these deaths mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, a decrease from the previous week. However, the total number of deaths registered was 3.7% higher than the 5-year average. In January, COVID-19 was the leading cause of death in both England and Wales. And with regards to With regards to COVID-19, our first story this evening is, of course, the timetable for easing lockdown. The First Minister has set out a timetable for the reopening of parts of society over the next 2 months. Stay-at-home regulations will be lifted on the 2nd of April and be replaced by guidance to stay local, with more services, including hairdressers, garden centres and non-essential click and collect services able to open from the 5th of April. More college students will also return to on-campus learning, and outdoor contact sports will resume for 12 to 17-year-olds on the 5th of April, if progress on vaccination and suppression of coronavirus continues. The Scottish Government then hopes to lift all restrictions on journeys in mainland Scotland on the 26th of April. Discussions will be held with island communities already in lower levels on the possibility of having a faster return to more socialising and hospitality, with restrictions on mainland travel to protect against importation of the virus. Vaccination of all 9 JCVI priority groups, more than half of the population, accounting for 99% of COVID-related fatalities, is expected to be completed by mid-April, supplies allowing. The dates outlined, enabled by strong new evidence that suggests vaccines reduce the chances of transmitting the virus, as well as reducing serious illness and death, even after first dose. Further expected easing on the 26th of April includes all retail premises, libraries, museums and galleries. Tourist accommodation would be available to open. Also, the hospitality sector would be able to reopen outdoors for the service of alcohol and potentially open indoors for non-alcohol service. Up to 4 people from 2 households could be able to socialise indoors in a public place such as a cafe or restaurant. 6 people from up to 3 households could be able to meet outdoors, and the limit on wedding and funeral attendances could be raised to 50 people. Gyms and swimming pools would be open for individual exercise, and non-essential childcare would be permitted. Non-essential work in people's homes and driving lessons could also resume from this date. On the 17th of May, it is hoped that groups of 4 from 2 households would be able to socialise indoors in a private home, and that cinemas, amusement arcades and small-scale outdoor and indoor events could restart within the limits on capacity. Further easing on this date would include outdoor contact sport for adults and indoor group exercise. The First Minister also indicated that in early June it is hoped that Scotland could move to level 1 and by the end of June to level 0. Grants of up to £7,500 for retailers and up to £19,500 for hospitality and leisure businesses will be paid in April to help businesses to reopen progressively. These one-off restart grants will replace the ongoing Strategic Framework Business Fund payments and will provide more money up front to help with the costs of reopening. Eligible businesses must have applied to the SFBF by the 22nd of March in order to receive these payments. The last 4-weekly SFBF payment of up to £3,000 will be paid on the 22nd of March as scheduled. Targeted restart grants for businesses that are not in scope for the current SFBF support package may be considered if the Scottish Government receives further consequentials from the UK Government. This all sounds like terrific news, Audrey. We're finally beginning to see the light at the end of the COVID tunnel. What was your reaction to hearing the news today?
Well, naturally delighted. Obviously, there was a fair bit of anticipation that the easing would start in earnest today, I suppose. I think what's good is that the timetable has got some dates in it, so people can kind of focus on those with the understanding that that could be subject to variation depending on how things go and the progress that we make. So good to have dates. I think it's measured. It's obviously still following the science, and all in all, I think it's really it's positive, but measured and careful.
And I noticed from sort of further down the item when I was reading it out today that the First Minister indicated that in early June it's hoped that Scotland could move to level 1 and by the end of June to level 0. This surely must hold out the hope, which many people must have had for months now, that they might actually be able to get a summer holiday this year. Do you think that's a realistic prospect?
Well, personally, I won't be planning on that. I think it's good, as I said earlier, it's good that we've got some dates to look at. But I think, and the First Minister's been very clear in really making sure that she stresses that we need to maybe work a little bit at making that happen. So the dates in June are a fantastic sort of glimmer of hope on the horizon. But we have a really clear role in making that happen. So continuing to follow the restrictions to a certain extent, sort of staying, as she says, staying local. But I think with the progress that we've been making on the vaccine programme, and I know certainly in Aberdeen we've got a mass vaccination centre, which I will be going to this coming week for my own vaccine. They've seen a terrific throughput. So I think if people keep picking up their vaccines, I think importantly, if supplies are consistent, because that's a sort of key part of this as well, then not with any luck, but I think we can be optimistic. Whether we can be too be too adventurous in terms of holidays, I think we'll just have to wait and see on that.
Perhaps a sort of Hamel-Damey kind of holidays, maybe visiting other places in Scotland. But one other question I wanted to put to you, actually, Audrey, is the fact that early in the bulletin, when we were talking about the COVID-19 statistics, it appears that there's some evidence beginning to emerge that the COVID-19 vaccination seems to be having an effect on the transmittability of the virus. It seems to be slowing it down. Obviously, it's not conclusive, but this is surely a very sort of optimistic and hopeful development. And perhaps if it does turn out to be the case, then things might be able to move faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I did pick that up, that the vaccine seems to be having, as you say, this positive impact on transmittability, but also on serious illnesses. So, I mean, that's fantastic news, and people will be really pleased to hear that. But I think the message still does remain that while that is explored in more detail by our sort of clinical experts and colleagues, I think that the message will remain: be cautious, be careful, and be responsible in how we behave.
I also noticed. I also noticed in the bulletin there, which I was just reading there earlier on, that grants of up to £7,500 for retailers and £19,500 for hospitality and leisure businesses are to be offered to businesses to assist them in the startup. Now, I'm not aware of whether this is being done in the rest of the UK, but surely this must be another very welcome piece of help for Scotland's hard-pressed retailers and hospitality businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly my own view throughout the sort of latter stages of lockdown has been that, and I think I maybe mentioned this last time I was on, that in order for us to move forward and take a kind of holistic approach out of lockdown, my view is that we need to have a sort of public health element along with a sort of business support element. So those two sort of parts of the approach, business support and public health recovery, but they have to kind of be in sync. So for me, to know that the announcement today has included business support going forward for in particular retail and the like, I think that's a really that will be very, very welcome as we sort of start to move towards the 2nd of April.
Um, just before I leave that particular subject, Audrey, when you mentioned there that you felt that there should be an element of public health in consideration for these grants, do you mean that you would like to see businesses making sure that they stick to public health guidelines after they've received or as a condition of receiving these grants?
Well, what I was really sort of more meaning was that in terms of recovery, I think that our sort of holistic recovery and the road forward, the business support, I wasn't talking so much about businesses following the guidelines and adhering to restrictions. What I was meaning that really the two are sort of interlinked with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So as the public health recovery progresses and develops, so too can our business recovery. So there is that sort of link, if you like.
Oh, I see. So you're linking the two things together. I understand, Audrey. Thank you for that. I'd like to move on if you a bit. I beg your pardon. I was just being reminded there that actually the numbers of COVID-19 cases have been rising in the past few days. I think particularly in Glasgow. Nobody's quite sure what to put this down to. Of course, many people have been linking it to the events surrounding the football supporters celebrating in George Square and other public gatherings. Do you think there's perhaps a need for more public information and also for more persuasion to prevent people from doing this kind of thing in future?
That's a tough one, to be honest. I mean, I think we naturally will maybe make some assumptions that the increasing cases in the Glasgow area. Does it link back to the events of a couple of weeks ago? Who knows? For me, I think what it stresses is that while we've had our announcement today, it just shows how fragile everything is. And so maybe, yes, messages around following the restrictions, getting your vaccine, 2 metre distancing, following the facts. They're really key messages. My slight concern is that for some people they become white noise, but I do think that this is so important that to have messaging, appropriate messaging everywhere all the time is probably a good position to be in, and a good a good approach to take.
Okay, so hopefully, people will realise that the easing of lockdown is dependent on us maintaining these restrictions until it's unnecessary to continue with them.
Absolutely, I think that's it in a nutshell. It's sort of steady going ahead. Just take care and don't get too excited.
Okay, thank you, Audrey, for that. I'm going to move on to our second story of the evening now, and that is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has passed stage 3 at Holyrood. Just as we came on air, the Scottish Parliament was coming to a close on the stage 3 proceedings of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, it's just happening at the moment, as far as I understand it. But the bill is expected to be passed. The bill incorporates the convention into Scots law and gives equal rights to everyone under the age of 18. The bill adds to earlier laws which give children equal protection from assault. Now, this is a landmark piece of legislation, isn't it, Audrey? I can't think of any other piece of human rights legislation which specifically gives rights to children. This must be a first, is it not?
Yeah, I believe so. And I'm just so proud that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have supported this. This goes really to, I suppose, the heart of improving life chances for our young people, our children. And I was actually discussing this earlier today with a journalism student in a local university who is doing a documentary as part of his dissertation around this very topic. So we had a very interesting discussion. And I think we were both in agreement that, again, this is sort of showing that Scotland has a sort of contemporary approach to children, to well-being, to supporting young people. And, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's the sort of most widely ratified treaty in the world. So, I'm absolutely delighted. I'm over the moon that this has gone through to stage 3.
Well, we understand at the moment, Audrey, that they're voting on it they're about to vote on it actually at the moment. We'll bring you the result of that as soon as we have it. But one of the questions that I wanted to put to you, Audrey, was the fact that children are being given their own human rights as part of a human rights bill in the Scottish Parliament. Is it, do you think, important for us now, once this bill has been passed and it becomes part of Scots law, for children to know about it? To be brought up in the expectation of having human rights, because up until now, human rights is not something we have traditionally taught our children about, is it?
It's not, to be honest, and I hadn't really ever thought about it in that sort of context. I think we've always just assumed that human rights was something that was sort of hovering around in the background, and perhaps because within Scotland, we have in recent years been quite focused on things like child protection, on getting it right for every child, well-being, and those kind of very important policy and legislative developments. It might be that that kind of discussion about human rights in the context of children has maybe just been sort of sitting a little bit in the background. So, I think the question is a really relevant one. And I think that going forward, the Scottish Government will make sure that they, I suppose, put together and develop sort of awareness so that children, as the most important group at the centre of this whole piece of work, are aware of it because it impacts on them.
We're just hearing that the vote is coming in as we speak. There's Ken McIntosh now. So we're just going over to Holyrood to hear the result of the vote. We are just waiting to hear from the presiding officer. I see a few smiling faces. So they're voting at present time, but this will be a landmark moment for Scotland's children. And as we were discussing earlier on, Audrey, perhaps this is something that, when children are old enough to understand it, it's something which might be mentioned in their education at school, that they do have human rights, even though they are children, something which I think has never happened in Scotland before.
That vote is now closed. Please let me know if you were not able to vote.
And of course, Scotland has a push button voting system in its parliament, far quicker than Westminster's. So we should be hearing...
Point of order for Gil Patterson.
Point of order for Gil Patterson.
Hello, Presiding Officer. I'm afraid my app wouldn't work this time. I would have voted yes, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. That will be noted. Your vote will be added.
So we still do not have the number yet.
Point of order from Anas Sarwar.
Point of order, Presiding Officer. My apologies. I wasn't able to log into the app and I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr. Sarwar. Your vote will be added. Thank you very much for the point of order.
So gradually building up the numbers. Hopefully everyone will have had a chance to vote within the next few moments. And we await the presiding officer's announcement any moment. I would imagine that many members of Holyrood Parliament will be voting remotely.
Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 24369 in the name of John Swinney is yes 114. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Bill is passed.
And there we have it. Children in Scotland now have their own Human Rights Bill and their Human Rights Act, Audrey. So a little moment of history there.
Very much so. I mean, just fantastic. A great update. And there's a lot of work gone into it. So brilliant.
It's delightful just to see that there were no abstentions and nobody voted against it as well, Audrey. That shows that there's cross-party agreement.
Very much so. I mean, it's really a kind of non-political issue, to be honest, and it's great to see that sort of real best practice in cross-party working.
Okay, Audrey. Well, listen, it's time for us to move on now. And the SNP has responded today to the UK government's defence and foreign policy review. The SNP has criticised the UK government's belatedly published Integrated Review of Defence and Foreign Policy as a document intended to show the world global Britain is an untrustworthy and unreliable international partner. The SNP's Shadow Defence spokesperson Stuart MacDonald MP said that renewing Trident nuclear weapons was already a shameful and regressive decision. However, increasing the cap on the number of Trident weapons the UK can stockpile by more than 40% is nothing short of abhorrent. deterrent. Now, Audrey, I don't know how much you have heard about the British government's plans in terms of its foreign policy, but this was, of course, the main thing that people took out of this announcement was this raising of the cap by 40%. Now, I understand that at the moment, the British government claims to have 180 serviceable warheads currently in its arsenal. So that would be taking it well up over 200 to 240 nuclear weapons. What effect is that going to have on Scotland, do you think?
Well, I think Scotland's long had a very difficult relationship with the concept of sort of nuclear capacity, and I'm speechless, to be honest. I haven't read the integrated review, but I think what it does show is that despite having sort of resolved to take a very different position on this, here we have yet again the UK government reneging on commitments that it made in the past around this issue. And not only have they done that, but they've actually increased, as you said earlier, increased the capacity. So I think this is a really sort of bleak day for Scotland. Having spent, you're aware of my professional background, and having spent some years in this world in a policing capacity, what I think is really difficult to get our heads around is the fact that this is nowhere in line with the current threat level that the United Kingdom faces, and is unlikely to be the case for some time to come. So it's baffling, quite frankly.
Audrey, having done a little bit of research on this story before we came on air, the other parts of the foreign policy also include taking more of an active role in American operations in the Pacific. In other words, basically sending British, I'm assuming British aircraft carriers such as the Queen Elizabeth towards the South China Sea, places like that. How much do you think this is to do perhaps with Britain riding on the coattails of American defence policy and basically abandoning its conventional weapons in favour of bolstering its nuclear armament, a shift away from defence of the United Kingdom and into projecting its power further away, basically towards the Pacific? What do you think they're trying to gain here? Are they trying to sabre rattle a little bit when they try to enter into negotiations with Pacific Rim countries?
I really can't answer that. I still don't understand that rationale. I would be interested to look at this a little bit more. What does concern me about this is that, courtesy of Brexit, we've essentially cut ourselves loose from, in particular, in a security context. And I spoke about this the last time I was on. I have real concerns about that. While I accept the current threat level in the UK is sitting at substantial, that basically means that a terrorist attack is likely. So for me, that doesn't square with this sort of the UK government is taking, and this sort of new interest in a part of the world that, to be honest, I don't see it featuring in our ongoing defence approach and our defence policy. So I think the Prime Minister's got some questions to answer and a little bit of explaining to do around this.
Well, I did a little further research before I came to the studio this evening, Audrey, and discovered that Aldermaston, which actually is in charge of manufacturing the nuclear explosive, the weapons which go on the tips of the missiles, is not actually able to produce 40% more nuclear warheads because it just doesn't have the capability to do it. Which begs the question, where does the United Kingdom intend to get 40% more warheads from? And the only place I could really think of might be the United States. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think, to be honest, anything's possible. I mean, I don't know whether this links to the recent elections in the United States and perhaps the UK government looking to develop a relationship with the new administration there. And going back to the point about the sort of capacity to make the nuclear warheads, that's the sort of reality on the ground that often Boris Johnson forgets to add into the detail. Yeah. So I'll be interested to follow this and see actually what does transpire in the cold light of day, because I mean we have become a little bit used to a little bit of spin coming out from Westminster, but not much meat on the bones in addition to that.
Well, it does seem on the face of it that British foreign policy is going more towards projecting power rather than defence, Audrey. I think that possibly is where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I think maybe it's a little bit of sort of marketing, but the reality is very different. I mean, we've got carriers that we have built, and we can't actually afford to deploy them and to maintain them. So I think there's a wee bit of maybe sort of inward reflecting required before we start to put some bells and whistles on our defence policy.
Okay, Audrey, well, let's leave that subject and we'll move on a couple of stories because we spent a little bit of time on the rights of the child story earlier on. Let's talk first, next of all, we're going to talk about the Greens launching their camp. Oh, beg your pardon? Okay, so I'm sorry, we're not going to do that story this evening because we are a little bit behind. But we are going to look at the use of plainclothes police in nightclubs, allegedly to protect women. Plans to protect women by putting plainclothes police officers in nightclubs are bizarre, frightening and spectacularly missing the point, campaigners and charities have said. The plans were outlined by the government as part of the steps it was taking to improve security and to protect women from predatory offenders. Called Project Vigilant, the programme can involve officers attending areas around clubs and bars in plain clothes, along with increased police patrols as people leave by closing time. Bryony Benyon, the managing director of the Good Night Out campaign, said that the government's plan was pretty frightening and that it feels like an increase in police intrusion into social spaces. With the in the news, of course, recently, the attack and abduction of a woman by, it appears at least, allegedly by a police officer. This seems like a strange way to react to it. But of course, it's an allegation against a serving police officer. Anyway, I can't obviously go into a live case, but it seems it's a bit of a strange reaction to it. In fact, because that particular woman was not abducted from a nightclub, was she? So what is behind this? Do you think the British government is just trying to find a quick way to react to this? Is this a knee-jerk reaction?
Very much so, in my view. I think it's a piece of PR that the UK government has started to circulate as a bit of a quick win, a bit of reassurance. We're on top of this. We're reacting to this absolutely tragic event, and it is no more than that. I have a policing background, as you know, and as soon as I heard this particular story, the first things that started to go through my head were, okay, what exactly is the plan? Where are the resources coming from? How on earth can you put police officers into a situation which is completely fluid, which is completely arbitrary? It's frankly a piece of nonsense.
So you think that this, well, we've already discussed this, it seems to be a knee-jerk reaction to an event which took place recently. Is there a better way to deal with this? You mentioned your background in policing. How do you think we should deal with it? Is there more to be done perhaps on the education of men themselves? Is there more to be done in that regard, do you think?
the issue of equality for women, or for around safety for women, these are complex and long established issues, and we continue to debate them quite rightly. But this particular suggestion, it is, to be honest, in some ways it's offensive. It seems to imply, or it could imply, to many women, that actually it's okay, we'll put a few plainclothes police officers out and about, and we'll look after you in pubs and clubs where you're vulnerable. I mean, it's patronising, to say the least. There are a huge range of legislative, policy, campaign, hugely important pieces of work that go on around the issue of safety for women and for men. So to kind of patronisingly throw in this quick win is frustrating, to say the least, and in some ways can undermine the really serious and important work that many women and men continue to do right across the UK.
So some people have suggested in social media, and in fact in other news outlets, that one of the solutions might be to involve more community police officers, part-time police officers, even just somebody with a high-vis jacket and a radio, who is there really to watch not the social spaces, but the quiet places, the parks, the back alleyways, the quiet, badly lit streets. Would that be a better method, do you think, for helping to deter this kind of crime in the first place?
I see where you're coming from, but the fact is that there are already a lot of these things in place. So in city centres, for example, you have CCTV. You've got police officers, you've got community wardens, you've got special constables, and you also have really important groups of volunteers, chaplains, for example, street pastors, that's what I mean. And they're all collectively doing a fantastic job to make city centres, particularly around nightclubs, safe spaces for women. We've also got we can't have this discussion and not mention the equally safe approach in Scotland, a huge piece of work and very important work in its own right. So I think it's about really getting this issue, or thinking about it in context, and I think being very careful not to scaremonger and to keep a perspective on what the extent of the issue is. Look at that and identify what all is being done, where are the gaps, and how do we make changes that improve the overall situation.
So you would suggest perhaps a more multi-level approach to this then, Audrey, where lots of different stakeholders are involved in a sort of across-the-board approach to this?
You have, you've nailed it, to be honest. A layered approach is definitely appropriate, insofar as in any situation you have members of the public who are vigilant and who we know respond to situations all the time. And then above that, you've got local authorities, police forces, you have voluntary organisations, and then you have Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament. So a layered approach is one, it's nothing new, but it's about continuing to look at what, if any, changes are required, how do we respond in an effective and a measured way.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Audrey. We'll be talking more about crime in Scotland later on in the programme. Now to our next story, and Kamala Harris pledges to fight for women and democracy at the United Nations, at her United Nations debut. The US Vice President Kamala Harris made her debut at the United Nations today, telling a meeting on gender equality that democracy fundamentally depends on empowerment of women and that democracy globally is increasingly under great strain. The United States would work to improve both, Harris said in a video statement to the 65th Commission on the Status of Women. The first female vice president in the United States said democracy requires constant vigilance, constant improvement. It is a work in progress, and today we know that democracy is increasingly under great strain. The status of democracy also depends fundamentally on the empowerment of women, not only because the exclusion of women in decision-making is a marker of a flawed democracy, but because the participation of women strengthens democracy, she said. Vice President Harris said that the President Joe Biden's administration would revitalise Washington's partnership with the UN. Would revitalise Washington's partnership with UN Women, a UN body dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women. Now, I don't suppose it's surprising that Kamala Harris, being the very first female vice president and vice president of an ethnic background, I think it's fair to say, should come out with a statement like this. But it must be very, I think, satisfying for women all over the world to hear this at the United Nations for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got a great respect for Kamala Harris. I think she and President Biden, I'm really looking forward to sort of watching how they take the United States forward across a range of issues after the last 4 years. But enough said about that. But yeah, I mean, I think she comes across as a woman of integrity, of great experience, and she's, she's strong. She's been around in politics for quite a long time. But in terms of this issue, she's clearly really, really very passionate, and rightly so. The overview that you gave there was really interesting to listen to, because I hadn't really picked up much of this story today. And I think while she's being very positive in her address, I think she's being very measured and realistic around the challenges that we still have associated with the sort of empowerment of women, about the democracy being under strain. But I also think that empowering women, in many ways, that begins with educating men and young boys. So, it's an interesting topic for discussion.
Do you think until Kamala Harris came to the position that she's in now, there had always been an assumption that democracy was guarded by men in suits, then it wasn't something which women traditionally were expected to be involved in? Do you think Kamala Harris can change that expectation, not just with this speech, but with her ongoing work at the UN?
I think in the short time she's vice president, I think she's shown herself to be to be very passionate and in the right place to take this forward. I think there's, the United States has been left a little bit bruised and battered, and it's no secret that the former president didn't particularly prioritise issues around gender equality in any sort of meaningful way. So I think she's got there's a lot of work ahead for her. But from what I've seen to date, that agenda and that big piece of work is in pretty safe hands with her.
When Joe Biden appointed Kamala Harris as when she ran as vice president, I should say, but Biden had to have endorsed her, and we know that Joe Biden has been very keen to ensure that women play a greater role in American democracy. But he must have had in mind the fact that by having a female vice president, by having Kamala Harris in this position, that she is almost by default going to become one of the most powerful female political figures in the world, isn't she? Certainly one of the most
She-
influential.
Yeah, very much so. And President Biden, he's a sort of consummate professional in his own right. He's been around a long time. He's vastly experienced, and I dare say he put some thought into this and realizes that really, in terms of taking the United States forward, in the next 4 years, that women within the White House is absolutely key. I suppose my only slight concern is that 4 years sounds a long time, but when you look at the amount of work that potentially there is to do, I think just to put gender equality back on the world stage, and also to perhaps sort of rebuild the United States' reputation around gender equality, that there's a lot to be done in that short space of time. And I do agree that with your comments earlier around democracy being under strain, and perhaps in some quarters there's a feeling that the sort of work around gender equality sometimes feels like it takes one step forward and two steps back. So, yeah, I really look forward to both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden making a fair bit of progress on this issue, but particularly on the world stage.
Hopefully being able to reverse some of the damage done, shall we say, by the Trump years. Anyway, let's move on now. And I said that we would be talking about crime again later on in the programme. Here we are again. Crime has almost halved over a decade. The Justice Secretary, Humza Yousaf, has welcomed official figures showing that the volume of crime covered by the survey in Scotland is down 46% since 2008-2009, with violent crime having fallen by nearly 2/5, 39% over the same period. The Scottish Crime and Justice Survey to 2019 to 2020 of around 5,600 adults interviewed before COVID-19 restrictions came into effect, which includes incidents not reported to the police, shows that people are now less likely to be a victim, with 1 in 8, that's 11.9% of adults, experiencing crime, compared to 1 in 5, or 20.4% in 2008-2009. As with previous years, adults in Scotland were less likely to have experienced crime than those in England and Wales during 2019-2020, with victimisation rates of 11.9% and 13% respectively. The proportion of adults experiencing property crime has fallen from 18% to 10%, with the estimated number of incidents almost halved, down 49% over this period. More people, 77% in 2019-2020, compared to 66% around a decade ago, report feeling very or fairly safe walking alone in their local area after dark. However, whilst men and women were more likely to feel safe in their communities in 2019-2020 than in 2008 and 2009, men remain more likely to feel safe, 90% compared to 65% for women in 2019-20. The survey identified that 1 in 8 female respondents, that's 12.5%, had experienced both psychological and physical abuse since the age of 16, while just under 1 in 20, that's 4.8%, of males had. The proportion of adults experiencing multiple victimisation, where someone was a victim of at least 2 incidents, fell from 8.2% to 3.6% between 2008 and 2019, representing 57% of all crime in 2019-2020. 1 in every 100 adults were victims of repeated incidents of violence, but their experiences accounted for almost 2/3 of violent crime in 2019 and 2020. So this is a good news story. This is showing, I think, if we needed any convincing of it, that Scotland has become a safer place in the last 10 years. This has got to be cause for celebration, surely, especially for the Scottish Government and for the people of Scotland.
This is a good news story. I think it's really great to hear this. And I have to be honest, when I first read the story earlier on today, that crime in Scotland had halved I must admit, I did think, this must just be the impact of COVID on crime figures. But actually, obviously, it's not. This is a much longer period that the justice report, the crime and justice report, relates to. So I think this is great. It's welcome. This has been the result of a big piece of work, and I think it perhaps shows that policing in modern day Scotland has changed, and to a certain extent has become more proactive and less reactive. So I'm really pleased to hear this.
You think perhaps also the increased numbers of police in Scotland compared to other parts of the United Kingdom has played a role in this?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a school of thought, and I have to say, I probably am one of them, who either feel or certainly have in the past taken the view that if you put more police officers on the beat, then you generate more crime, because if you are out and about, the chances are you will see crime, you will have crime reported to you, and so on. What we've seen in this report seems to dispel that. And so I think that in some ways gives us some added reassurance.
So you think perhaps the presence of increased numbers of police officers on the streets has acted as an effective deterrent, but has also bolstered the confidence of the public to feel safer in their communities?
Very much so. I mean, the public like to see police officers on the beat. I like to see a police officer on the beat. And as you know, I'm currently a councillor in a very mixed area in Aberdeen, and I've got a great relationship with our policing team, and they're very, very visible. That allows them to, in many ways, do their job better. They get to know the area well, they get to know the locals very well, and that in itself does make, I suppose, an indirect contribution to crime figures, but also to public confidence and public reassurance. So it is a little bit of that feel-good factor for sure, but also the presence and visibility of police officers in some ways can be a deterrent in its own right.
Okay, well, let's leave that subject and we'll continue on to the next story. And that is investing with purpose. Plans have been published to increase the value of private investment flowing into Scotland and to make the country a global centre of ethical finance. The Global Capital Investment Plan contains 30 measures to increase the availability of private capital to businesses and projects, whilst improving links with financial centres. Priority will be given to building markets in sectors where Scotland is already strong and which are attractive to global investors. These include low carbon transition, digital, health and life sciences, and high-value manufacturing. The Scottish Government is investigating new financial products, including green bonds, which enable investors to support sustainable products and initiatives, and a Series A fund, which would channel private capital into innovative companies wishing to expand. It is also linked with the Global Ethical Finance Institute to stage a series of events showcasing Scotland's investment opportunities in the run-up to November's COP26 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Again, this is a good news story, isn't it, Audrey? The Scottish Government is now actively seeking ways to funnel more capital investment into Scotland's emerging industries to build up this new green economy.
This is a great story, and I'll be honest, I hadn't heard much about this. I wasn't really knowledgeable about this until recently, and I do remember on the subject of sort of ethical finance, if you like, quite some years ago, I had a wee bit of money that I'd received from my grandparents. And I asked a financial advisor about the opportunities that existed to invest my money in ethical investments. And he kind of looked at me as if to say, I'm not actually sure what you're talking about. And in any case, sort of get into the real world. So all these years on, it looks as though this is actually becoming a much more serious option. So I'm really pleased to hear this. And I think, again, it shows that, Scotland is a fairly sort of contemporary, or takes a contemporary approach across a wide range of issues. And why not investment? What looking at opportunities to really underpin our green recovery and a green economy as we head into the next few years and out of COVID.
Well, let's hope this happens. It certainly seems like a good start, Audrey. Now to our final story this evening, and Young Carer Grant has paid out more than £860,000 since it was launched. The figures released today, which coincide with Young Carers Action Day, reveal that the Scottish Government has paid out more than £860,000 to eligible young carers since the Young Carer Grant opened in October 2019. Over 2,900 applications have been authorised to support young people aged 16, 17 and 18 who spend an average of 16 hours a week caring for someone who receives disability benefit. The Young Carer Grant is an annual payment of £305.10 made to young carers to spend on anything they like, for example a subscription to a video or music streaming service, new clothes or something else that helps them to take a break from their caring responsibilities. Young carers have previously received the grant, will still meet the eligibility criteria, can reapply 12 months from the date of their previous successful application. So it seems that not only are thousands of young carers taking up the Scottish Government's offer of this money, but they can also reapply year upon year, Audrey. This sounds like a tremendous idea.
I think it's really welcome, particularly at this point in time when we're still, we're still feeling the impacts of the pandemic, and it just gives young carers, I think the key thing is it gives them reassurance and confidence that from a financial point of view, there is, there's a longer, there is support in the longer term available for them. And I mean, it's clearly been a hugely successful piece of work, just given the figures that you've spoken about in terms of uptake of the funding that has been on offer. So I think it's a really good, worthwhile and targeted piece of work.
I think anybody who has been looking after a relative with disabilities, but particularly a young person, they don't get the respite, do they? Because they're there 24 hours a day helping to look after that person. And young people have suffered disproportionately, especially with their mental health recently because of COVID. And this gives them a chance to enjoy themselves, to take a break. Surely this should be done every year. That's right. I think you're right. A lot of young carers, and I have a lot of young carers in my ward, and in fact, I was speaking to a couple yesterday on a Zoom call, and I think that the problem is that they have this assumption that because they're young, because they're fit and healthy, that they can just carry on, and perhaps they don't have the sort of awareness that maybe older people like I do have around just that point where you maybe need to just sort of step back, take a breath, and think a little bit about you and your own well-being. So, yeah. And I think the other thing is a lot of young carers are in education, whether that's in full-time education or a part-time course. And so, the bottom line is that they don't have that much wriggle room. So I think this opportunity, from a financial perspective, is really welcome. It's one less thing for them to worry about. Well, listen, I'm afraid we've run out of time this evening, Audrey, but thank you for your comments on our last story there. It's just enough time before I close out the show this evening to remind you that we're in the middle of a major crowdfunder at the moment. Broadcasting Scotland wants to be here for the big events of 2021, and to do that we need your help. So if you would like to become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland, or you'd like to make an individual donation or even volunteer, you can do that by following the instructions at the bottom of your screen now. But that's it from this evening's edition of Scotland at 7. It just remains for me to thank my guests. Thank you, Audrey, for being an excellent guest this evening. I hope to see you again on the programme very soon.
Yeah, look forward to it.
And so from all of us here from the studios at Broadcasting Scotland, a very good night to you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes,
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.